Chapter 1. The Garden Fete. It was, by every outward measure, a perfectly ordinary English afternoon, one of those rare, golden days at the tail end of August when summer seems determined to outstay its welcome. The air in Little Skelton shimmered gently with late sunshine, setting the distant fields aglow and coaxing the roses in the vicarage garden into a last, showy bloom. Sparrows hopped among the hedge, and the distant toll of church bells, calling for evensong rehearsal, blended with the delighted squeals of children as the annual garden fete unfolded, as it always had, on the immaculate lawns behind St. Mildred's. From her habitual place beneath the rose arbor, Miss Jane Marple surveyed the festivities with an unobtrusive attentiveness that belied her gentle appearance. A small, silver-haired lady in a pale blue cardigan and sensible shoes, she was an unremarkable fixture of village life, just as she preferred it. Her fingers worked with rhythmic calm, knitting what appeared to be a tea cozy, though she alone knew it was meant for her great-niece in Sussex. Around her, the village's full cast of characters was on display, as carefully arranged as the cakes in the tent. There was the vicar's new wife, Mrs. Gillingham, bustling about in her straw hat and new summer dress, determined to see that the fete ran like clockwork, if not better. Her voice rose above the others, issuing instructions, "Mind the bunting, dear. No, no, the cucumber sandwiches go on the blue plates," leaving a trail of faintly harried volunteers in her wake. Mr. Hargreaves, the stooped bank manager with suspiciously dark hair for a man his age, was gamely taking his turn at the coconut shy, watched by his formidable wife, whose lips pursed in silent critique each time he missed. Old Dr. Archer, retired now but still summoned in emergencies, wandered about the refreshment tent with a sherry in hand, recounting tales of minor surgeries performed during the Great War to anyone who would listen. And then there were the new faces, still the subject of much speculative chatter. Most notable was Mr. Lionel Blackwood, the mysterious Londoner who had acquired the crumbling Sutherland estate just outside the village bounds. Tall, graying at the temples, with an air of well-concealed impatience, Mr. Blackwood kept mainly to himself, offering polite smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Even now, as he ambled near the edge of the festivities, he seemed to measure the villagers with an almost clinical detachment. Miss Marple's eyes lingered briefly on Mrs. Price, Little Skelton's postmistress and the engine of its rumour mill. She stood at the jam stall, whispering behind a gloved hand to her bosom companion, Mrs. Vale, both of them pausing to cast meaningful glances at the vicar's wife. Miss Marple caught only a snippet. Modern ideas. Never was such goings-on in Mrs. Gloucester's day, before the conversation drifted away like the scent of lavender. Children raced past, skirts and trousers grass-stained and wild, shrieking with delight as they dodged between the grown-ups. Even the local police constable, young P.C. Farrow, had joined in, holding a sack for the much-anticipated children's race, his helmet set at a jaunty angle. For all its apparent cheer, Little Skelton was a place where memories ran deep and grievances, once kindled, could smolder for years. Only a month earlier, the village had been unsettled by the discovery that the Women's Institute funds, painstakingly raised through endless cake sales and raffles, had disappeared. Though the official investigation had found no evidence of foul play, Mrs. Price confided in all who would listen that she had her doubts. And there was still talk about last year's church silver theft, never solved. To outsiders, these were small, even laughable troubles. But Miss Marple knew better. In small villages, it was the trivial things that so often led to tragedy. As the clock on the church tower struck 4, the fete entered its languorous peak. The tables groaned under the weight of sponges, fruitcakes, and jams, each vying for a coveted blue ribbon. Mrs. Radley, a formidable baker, presided with the quiet triumph of one who expected to win and was not disappointed, accepting her first prize certificate with a faint smile and a shrewd, sidelong glance at her nearest rivals. Near the lemonade stand, young Timothy Blake, a child of perhaps 8 notorious for his sticky fingers, was being gently scolded by Miss Peters, his governess, while simultaneously eyeing the plate of Battenberg left unattended by the tombola. Miss Marple, watching this small scene, smiled inwardly at the sheer predictability of human nature. Suddenly, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, perhaps a dropped plate, the beginnings of a quarrel, or merely the hush that sometimes settles over a crowd without warning. But Miss Marple, always attuned to these undercurrents, felt it before she heard it. A ripple of tension running through the guests, as though some unspoken signal had passed among them. Then, a scream. Piercing, unrestrained, and unmistakably real. It sliced through the genteel clamor of the fate like a knife, turning all conversation into stunned silence. Miss Marple saw heads snap around, teacups frozen in midair, a slice of Victoria sponge left dangling from a fork. The cry came from the far end of the garden, near the shrubbery bordering the gravel path to the old Sutherland estate. Within seconds, a knot of people began to form, drawn by morbid curiosity and a kind of fearful urgency. Miss Marple rose without haste, setting her knitting aside with practiced care. As she made her way toward the disturbance, her gaze swept the gathering. She noted Mrs. Gillingham, suddenly pale, clutching her pearls as though expecting some ghastly apparition to materialize. Mr. Blackwood stood statue still, his lips compressed, eyes flickering to the shadows beneath the yews. Mrs. Radley, prize certificate in hand, hovered uncertainly at the edge of the crowd, looking for all the world like a woman who'd stumbled onto a scene in which she did not wish to be involved. At the scene itself, the villagers had parted to reveal the source of the distress. A young woman, Edith Vale, daughter of Mrs. Vale, collapsed on the grass, her hand outstretched, eyes wide with horror. A broken teacup lay beside her, spilling its contents onto the ground. Dr. Archer had already dropped to his knees, fumbling for a pulse, while Edith's mother wailed, "She's fainted. Help her, please. Oh, Edith, wake up. Make room, please make room." P.C. Farrow barked, all traces of boyishness gone. He crouched beside Dr. Archer, peering anxiously at the girl's face. "Is she?" "She's breathing," Dr. Archer pronounced with relief. "A faint, that's all. But something frightened her. See her eyes? Dilated." "What did she see?" demanded Mrs. Price, always ready to supply a theory. "Or did she know something we don't?" Miss Marple quietly knelt beside the girl, her manner calm but her mind alert. She saw, just beyond the point where Edith had fallen, a scrap of pale muslin caught in the hedge, fluttering like a signal. Her eyes followed the faint outline of a man's shoeprint pressed into the soft earth beneath the laurel bush. She saw, too, that the broken teacup had not merely slipped. It had been dashed from Edith's hand with violence. No one else seemed to notice these things. The villagers closed around, a wall of confusion and well-meaning chatter. Dr. Archer and P.C. Farrow carried Edith to a garden bench, fanning her with handkerchiefs. Mrs. Vale muttered prayers. Mrs. Gillingham looked desperately for someone to blame. Only Miss Marple, in her quiet, methodical way, lingered by the hedge, fingers brushing the torn muslin, eyes measuring the footprint. She did not draw attention to herself. She never did. But already, as she made her way back to her chair, she was considering the problem not as a sudden, isolated drama, but as the inevitable eruption of something long buried. A secret, perhaps, that someone would do anything to keep hidden. And so, as the first shadows crept across the fate and laughter faltered into uneasy whispers, Miss Marple resumed her seat beneath the arbor. Her knitting needles resumed their dance, but her mind was miles away. Even before the villagers began to whisper, she knew that the peace of Little Skelton had been shattered, and that the most dangerous secrets were always those one never meant to tell. Whispers in the afternoon. The fate was not quite over, yet the spell of its cheerful normalcy had been irrevocably broken. The sun, now dipping lower, cast long shadows over the vicarage lawn, and the air, still heavy with rose and cut grass, took on a taut, expectant quality. The villagers had become self-conscious, as though they too, like the lawns and flowers, were suddenly on display. Edith Vale, revived with smelling salts and a brisk fussing from her mother, sat quietly on the bench beneath the yew tree, pale and withdrawn. The crowd hovered, eager to comfort but also, unmistakably, to eavesdrop. Dr. Archer pronounced that she needed rest, calm, and perhaps a little weak tea, but it was the sort of prescription he had given 100 times before, and none of the onlookers seemed satisfied. Already, a gentle yet persistent murmur of conjecture was circulating, each voice certain it alone had grasped the true nature of the event. Mrs. Gillingham bustled about, pressing cups of tea into anxious hands, determined to maintain an air of composure for the good of the parish. "Children! Inside for lemonade, please, quickly now," she trilled, waving her arms with theatrical briskness. Her gaze darted about as though she might, by sheer force of will, restore the fete to its orderly routine. But the mothers of Little Skelton were not so easily distracted. They clustered around the garden's edges, voices dropping to the conspiratorial low that always accompanied a crisis. "Did you see her face? Like she'd seen a ghost," whispered Mrs. Price, leaning in close to Mrs. Vale. "Do you suppose? Oh, I dare say it was the heat, poor lamb." "Nonsense," countered Mrs. Radley, fanning herself with a folded program. "No one faints from heat on a day like this. It was fright, mark my words. Fright or, well, you know what they say about that old path by the Sutherland place." Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved with her usual unobtrusive grace. She accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Gillingham, murmured her thanks, and positioned herself at the edge of the gathering where she could listen without appearing to do so. From her vantage point, she could see not only Edith, wan and trembling beside her mother, but also the subtle choreography of the crowd. Mr. Hargreaves, for instance, had placed himself squarely between the fete and the shrubbery, as though to shield the scene of Edith's collapse from further scrutiny. Mr. Blackwood, the London newcomer, stood just behind the main cluster, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. The young constable, P.C. Farrow, had taken it upon himself to secure the area, politely but firmly steering children and the more curious adults away from the hedge where the incident had occurred. To the villagers of Little Skelton, there was nothing so exhilarating, or so secretly relished, as the whiff of scandal. As the fate-scheduled events limped along, a half-hearted raffle here, a distracted attempt at charades there, most eyes and ears remained fixed on Edith and her mysterious faint. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, studied the scene with the detachment of one who had observed many such dramas, both real and theatrical, over the years. She noted the way Mrs. Vale's hand never left her daughter's arm, the rigid set of Mr. Blackwood's jaw, the darting glances exchanged between Mrs. Price and Mrs. Radley. Even Dr. Archer, usually so voluble, had grown uncharacteristically quiet, sipping his tea with eyes fixed on the horizon. Gradually, the conversations around Miss Marple shifted from open concern to the subtler art of speculation. She heard, in the space of a single afternoon, at least 5 explanations for Edith's collapse. Some blamed the weather, some her nerves, others hinted at family trouble. "They say Mr. Vale's been spending more time in London than is quite proper, don't you know?" A few invoked darker forces, old superstitions that clung stubbornly to the edges of village life. "It's that path," said Mrs. Radley, lowering her voice as though the very words might summon trouble. "Never brought anything but misfortune, ever since the Sutherlands left. I've always said so. My birdie found a dead rook there, 2 winters past. A bad omen, I said then, and look." Now, none of that," chided Mrs. Gillingham, who had caught the end of the remark. "We're sensible people here, Mrs. Radley. This is 1952, not the Middle Ages." Still, a shadow lingered over the fete, and as the afternoon waned, the guests began to drift away in uneasy pairs and trios, voices lowered and glances wary. The prize cakes were wrapped and carried home, the tables cleared with perfunctory speed, and the bunting left to flutter in the rising dusk. Yet no one, not even the vicar's wife, could quite summon the enthusiasm to call the event a success. As the last of the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the garden, ostensibly searching for her misplaced ball of yarn. In reality, she wished to inspect the scene of Edith's collapse a second time, now blessedly free of spectators. Moving slowly, she knelt by the laurel bush and examined the patch of trampled grass. The scrap of muslin was still there, its edge frayed as though torn in haste. She touched it lightly, then studied the shoe print pressed into the soft earth. It was too large for Edith, too clean to have come from a gardener's boot. She straightened and glanced up to see P.C. Farrow approaching, looking awkward but earnest. "Excuse me, Miss Marple. Is there anything you noticed?" before it happened. Miss Marple smiled gently. Only what everyone else noticed, I'm sure. Though I do think it odd that Edith was so frightened by something none of us saw. Did she say anything when she came round? P.C. Farrow shook his head. Not really. Just looked about in a panic and asked for her mother. I tried to get her to tell me what happened, but Dr. Archer said it would be better to wait. Quite so, said Miss Marple, her voice soothing. Young people can be terribly impressionable. I'm sure a good night's rest will do wonders. Yet as the constable departed, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint frown. She glanced again at the shoe print and the muslin, and then toward the distant, shuttered windows of the Sutherland estate. Something troubled her, something about the pattern of behavior, the subtle tension in the crowd, the sense that Edith's collapse was not the simple drama it appeared. As dusk deepened and the village lamps flickered on, Miss Marple made her way home along the winding lane, her mind busy with questions. She passed Mrs. Vale, who hurried her daughter indoors, and Mr. Blackwood, who lingered at the gates of the estate, smoking in silence. The village, which only hours before had felt so open and sunlit, now seemed to shrink in upon itself, secrets gathering like clouds before a storm. At her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and sat quietly by the window, the glow of the setting sun painting long shadows on the wallpaper. She reviewed every detail, the scream, the muslin, the shoe print, the barely concealed anxiety of several fete-goers. There were connections, she felt sure, but the thread that bound them lay just out of sight. Tomorrow, she knew, the village would awaken with stories on every tongue. Some would blame Edith's collapse on nerves, others on the fanciful shadows of the old Sutherland estate. But Miss Marple, wise in the ways of human nature, suspected that this incident was merely the prologue to something far more disturbing, a shadow falling over Little Skelton, and a secret waiting, at last, to be unearthed. She reached for her knitting once more, the needles clacking softly in the deepening silence. In the stillness, she allowed herself one brief, worried thought. What had Edith seen that none of the rest had? And what old, hidden truth was the village itself so desperate to keep concealed? Miss Marple glanced out at the lane, where the last of the villagers slipped home beneath the gathering dusk. She sat back, her eyes thoughtful and keen, knowing that in Little Skelton, every secret, no matter how carefully buried, would, in time, demand its reckoning. Chapter 2. Shadows at Dawn. The dawn following the fete arrived cloaked in gray clouds, the sort that seemed to press close about the roofs and chimneys of Little Skelton, making even the neatest gardens appear slightly shrunken, the hollyhocks and foxgloves heavy with dew. The hush of early morning was broken only by the clink of milk bottles, the distant bark of a dog, and the soft scrape of Miss Marple's window as she opened it to let in the fresh air. She stood there for a moment, surveying the world with her usual gentle composure, the faintest frown on her brow. The village always had a peculiar stillness after an excitement, as though the very hedges leaned in, eager for the first crumbs of gossip. This morning was no exception. Even before breakfast, she spied Mrs. Price out on her front step, waving a letter at Mrs. Vale, who hurried past with her daughter Edith, bundled in a thick cardigan despite the mildness of the day. Miss Marple watched as the two women exchanged words, something hurried, clipped, almost furtive. Edith, eyes averted, kept her head low and did not look up at the windows, though every curtain on the lane seemed to twitch in unison. When they had passed, Miss Marple turned from the window and made her way downstairs, her thoughts ticking quietly as she set the kettle to boil. By 9 o'clock, the village was humming with fresh speculation. The post office was, as always, the epicenter of the storm. Mrs. Price presided from behind the counter, dispensing letters, parcels, and sly observations with equal efficiency. The news of Edith's faint at the fete had, if anything, become even more dramatic overnight. Frightened clean out of her wits, she was. Mrs. Price told Mrs. Radley, who had arrived for her usual roll of stamps but lingered for a chat. They say her lips were blue, and her hands shaking so she could hardly hold her cup. I hear Dr. Archer's going to call on her this morning, and no wonder. It's a wonder she's not taken to her bed, poor lamb. Mrs. Radley, never one to be outdone in matters of concern, pursed her lips. Well, I blame that Blackwood fellow. always hanging about the Sutherland place. It's not natural, the way he prowls at all hours. Mark my words, nothing good will come of it." Mrs. Price leaned in, voice dropping. "And did you notice how he was the first to the scene? Not even a hair out of place. My Bert says he saw Blackwood out by the shrubbery at dawn, just standing and looking, as though he were waiting for someone, or something." Unseen in the shadow of the sweet shop window, Miss Marple listened to the exchange as she selected a tin of barley sugar for her great-niece. She paid, thanked Mrs. Price with a smile, and stepped out into the square, where she paused for a moment, considering what she'd overheard. The villagers, it seemed, had decided upon their suspect before any evidence could be gathered, a phenomenon she had observed more than once in her long years. The sky threatened rain, but the air was thick with anticipation rather than storm. At the far end of the square, Miss Marple saw Dr. Archer climbing the steps to the Vale house. He paused, hat in hand, and glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, before rapping gently at the door. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the moment, wondering at its subtle tension. On her way back, she passed Mr. Hargreaves, who greeted her with exaggerated heartiness. "Lovely morning, Miss Marple. Or as lovely as we're likely to get after yesterday's excitement." "Indeed, Mr. Hargreaves. I dare say the village will recover soon enough. One does hope Edith is feeling better." The bank manager nodded, but his eyes shifted away. "Oh, I'm sure she'll be right as rain. Young girls, nerves and all that. I must say, it does make one realize how quickly things can go awry, even in the best-ordered places." He hurried off, and Miss Marple watched him go, a faint line of curiosity deepening at the corner of her mouth. For all his breezy words, Mr. Hargreaves seemed troubled. As she approached the turning near the church, she encountered Mrs. Gillingham, clutching a notebook and looking thoroughly distracted. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad to see you. Do you think, should we call off next week's WI luncheon? Feels rather, unseemly under the circumstances. Mrs. Vale hasn't replied to my note, and several ladies say they simply can't face another gathering just yet." "I shouldn't think it necessary to cancel, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "These little shocks, unpleasant though they are, tend to fade in time. It may even be a comfort to have the usual routines." Mrs. Gillingham gave a grateful smile, but her fingers tugged anxiously at her sleeve. "Oh, you're probably right as always. Still, I do wish things hadn't gone so strange. If only we knew what frightened Edith. The children are full of wild stories. I've had to tell Sarah 3 times that there's no ghost in the Sutherland woods." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Children do have such vivid imaginations, don't they?" She left Mrs. Gillingham and continued toward the green, pausing by the low wall that bordered the Sutherland estate. From here, the old house rose above the trees, its windows shuttered, the paint on the portico peeling in elegant neglect. There was no sign of Mr. Blackwood. Yet Miss Marple, never one to trust mere appearances, studied the boundary hedge and the curve of the overgrown drive. It was then she noticed something unusual. A small group of boys, led by Tommy Radley and his friend Peter Sims, clustered by the side gate. They were crouched low, whispering intently. Every so often, one would cast a glance toward the house, then scuttle back to the group. Miss Marple approached quietly. "Good morning, boys. You're not getting into mischief, I hope?" Tommy straightened, cheeks red. "No, Miss Marple. We thought we saw someone in the woods. Last night, after the fete. A man, I think." Peter, bolder than his friend, piped up. "He was carrying something, miss. Like a sack, only it didn't look heavy." "And did you see where he went?" Tommy nodded. "Into the woods, near the old well." Miss Marple smiled, her manner gentle but her eyes sharp. "Well, boys will be boys. But do be careful, won't you? The grounds can be treacherous, especially near the well." She left them to their game, but her mind was busy. Someone, possibly Blackwood, but not certainly, had been near the Sutherland grounds after dark. And, curiously, carrying something the children couldn't identify. By midday, rain threatened in earnest, sending most villagers scurrying indoors. Only Miss Marple lingered, pausing again at the sight of the previous day's drama. The laurel bush looked unremarkable, but she took a moment to examine the grass, now bent and muddy where so many feet had pressed it down. The scrap of muslin was gone, and the earth where the shoe print had been was churned by the constable's boots. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple prepared herself a simple lunch. She considered her observations as she ate in quiet solitude, reviewing the tangled web of suspicion that had grown overnight. The villagers were quick to find a scapegoat, yet human nature, she reflected, was rarely so tidy. Someone knew more than they had said, perhaps several someones. And the mystery was far from solved. As the afternoon wore on, she received a brief note from Mrs. Vale, thanking her for her concern and assuring her that Edith was much improved, though still shaken. There was, however, a curious postscript: "Please do not mention yesterday to anyone else. Edith is quite determined to forget the entire matter." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, letting the words settle. A village secret was like a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples spread outward, touching every shore. But the truth, in her experience, had a way of rising, no matter how carefully it was concealed. Outside, the rain began at last, drumming softly against the window. Miss Marple watched the drops trace slow paths down the glass. Somewhere in Little Skelton, she felt certain, the answer was already taking root, quiet, insistent, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm soothing her thoughts, and resolved to pay a quiet visit to the Vale house the next day. For now, it was best to let the storm pass, and the village, restless and watchful, to settle into uneasy quiet once more, behind shuttered windows. The rain had not relented by morning. It swept in fitful bursts against Miss Marple's cottage window, gathering in silver rivulets upon the glass. Yet rain, like rumor, seldom deterred the villagers of Little Skelton from their routines. By 10 o'clock, boots splashed on the lanes and umbrellas bobbed from porch to gate, neighbors stopping for brisk words before hurrying on, huddled against the wind. Miss Marple, in her sensible mackintosh and stoutest shoes, set out for the Vale house. She carried a small basket lined with a blue-checked napkin. Inside, a jar of quince jelly and a fresh honey cake, gestures of neighborly concern that no one in the village would refuse, regardless of circumstances. The walk was brief but pleasant, even with the chill damp, for it afforded Miss Marple ample opportunity to observe the subtle changes in Little Skelton's morning routine. She noted the drawn curtains at the Radley house, unusual for so late in the morning, the hasty way Mrs. Hargreaves greeted her from the porch, and the conspicuous absence of Mr. Blackwood, whose car remained hidden behind the Sutherland estate's locked gates. When she reached the Valles' modest cottage, a red brick affair with ivy around the lintel, Miss Marple paused a moment beneath the dripping eaves. She heard the muffled voices of mother and daughter within, a strained cadence to the words. She pressed the bell, and after a few moments, Mrs. Vale opened the door. The woman's expression was carefully composed, her mouth tight but her eyes flickering with relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, how very kind. Do come in, you mustn't stand in the rain." The entryway smelled faintly of lavender polish and new bread. Edith sat by the sitting-room window, a blanket around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the blurred shapes beyond the glass. She turned at the sound of Miss Marple's voice, her lips twisting in a brave attempt at a smile. "Thank you for coming," Edith said quietly. "And for yesterday. I'm sorry for the trouble I caused." "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, setting her basket down on the side table. "These little upsets come to us all, sooner or later. You mustn't think another thing of it." Mrs. Vale hovered, fussing with the tea things. She poured with a trembling hand, spilling a little, but Miss Marple pretended not to notice. Instead, she settled herself in the chintz armchair and accepted a cup of strong, sweet tea. For a time, the conversation circled harmlessly. The weather, the difficulty of keeping the garden weed-free in such wet, the unfortunate effect of rain on the vicar's planned repairs to the church roof. But beneath the surface, a tension persisted. Miss Marple, adept at the art of gentle encouragement, waited until Mrs. Vale was called away to tend to something boiling in the kitchen before leaning forward to address Edith alone. "My dear, if you'd rather not talk about it, I quite understand. But sometimes the burden is lessened when it is shared. Were you ill before the fate? Or was it, perhaps, something you saw? Edith's fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. She was silent a moment, her gaze distant. It was silly, really. I suppose I was tired, but I thought I saw someone in the shrubbery. Just for a moment, as if he were hiding. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. A man? Do you think it was someone you recognized? Edith hesitated, her breath shallow. I'm not sure. It might have been Mr. Blackwood. Or maybe not. He was dressed in dark clothes and it was so quick. But he was watching me. I felt it. And then I tripped, and everything went odd. Miss Marple reached out, briefly touching the girl's hand. It's natural to be shaken. But do remember, the mind can play tricks when one is startled. You needn't fear you won't be believed. At this, Edith looked up, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't want Mother to worry. She hasn't been herself since Father started working away so much. There was more in that sentence than mere loneliness, Miss Marple thought. The faint suggestion of something strained and unresolved. Before she could gently press further, Mrs. Vale returned, her composure restored, and the subject changed at once to parish matters and the WI luncheon. Miss Marple left soon after, but not before pressing Edith's hand and murmuring, "You know where I am, should you wish to talk." Back outside, the rain eased to a persistent drizzle. Miss Marple set off down the lane, her mind sifting through the encounter. Edith had seen someone, perhaps Blackwood, perhaps not, lurking in the shrubbery just before her collapse. The girl was frightened, that was clear, but was it the man she saw, or something she already suspected about him? Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice behind her. Miss Marple! Out and about despite the weather, I see. It was Dr. Archer, his coat flapping, spectacles beaded with rain. Doctor, I was just visiting Edith. She seemed quite a bit improved, though still unsettled. Dr. Archer nodded, voice low. Yes, I'm keeping an eye on her. She's nervous, but physically sound. Not the first fainting spell in that family, you know. Mrs. Vale herself was rather frail as a girl. Still, there's something odd. She wouldn't meet my eyes, nor would her mother. He paused, clearing his throat. Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I wish we knew what happened in those bushes. P.C. Farrow tells me he found nothing suspicious after everyone left, but I've learned never to discount your instincts. Miss Marple smiled, tucking her hands into her sleeves. You are kind, Doctor. My instincts tell me only that Little Skelton is a village full of secrets, and some are best left to come out in their own time. As they parted ways, Miss Marple noted the presence of Mrs. Radley across the street, standing with Mrs. Price beneath a dripping shop awning. Both women watched her with interest, heads inclined, their conversation pausing as she passed. Rumors, she guessed, were already spreading anew. At the crossroads, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Mr. Blackwood's car pulling away from the Sutherland gates. She watched its slow progress, deliberate, as if the driver wished to be seen. A curtain twitched at the Hargreaves' house. She wondered, not for the first time, whether Blackwood's arrival in Little Skelton had brought trouble with it, or merely exposed what was already there. She made her way home and spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, piecing together scraps of conversation and fleeting glances, small details others missed, the mud on Blackwood's tires, the faint perfume of fear in Mrs. Vale's voice, the persistent way Mrs. Price lingered near any new whisper. The muslin scrap was gone now, cleared, perhaps, by someone eager to remove evidence. The children who'd seen a man with a sack near the well. Was it related, or merely one more village fancy? As dusk fell, the rain eased at last, leaving the hedges dripping and the air washed clean. Miss Marple lit her lamp and sat by her window, knitting in hand, watching as darkness crept along the lanes of Little Skelton. Somewhere, behind shuttered windows, the truth waited, biding its time. In the distance, a single owl called, solemn and persistent. Miss Marple listened, the click of her needles steady, her mind sharper than ever. She knew from long experience that, in villages like these, the past was never truly past, and every secret, no matter how small, cast a long shadow. Chapter 3. Under the Surface. The next morning brought a watery sunlight to Little Skelton, tentative and thin after so many days of rain. Its weak rays gilded the hedges and puddles, and for a fleeting hour the village felt almost itself again. But beneath the gentle facade, a nervous energy lingered, a sense of waiting, as if the whole of Little Skelton was holding its breath, fearful of what the next whisper might bring. Miss Marple, ever attuned to such subtleties, sensed the shift as soon as she ventured out. Her first stop was the post office, where she hoped to purchase a new packet of needles and, not incidentally, to catch up on the undercurrent of talk that always gathered there. She found the shop more crowded than usual, villagers crammed in close under the pretense of buying stamps or sending parcels. The usual easy chatter was absent, replaced by low, urgent voices and glances exchanged over half-turned shoulders. Mrs. Price presided at the counter, eyes sharp beneath her rimless spectacles, lips thin with importance. She was in her element. Nothing stirred in Little Skelton without her knowing, or at least without her inventing an explanation that would suit her mood. This morning, she was in a state of high agitation, answering each inquiry with a brisk, "Well, I couldn't possibly say," or, "That is not for me to tell, Mrs. Radley," while still managing to hint at knowledge far more dangerous than she would ever admit outright. As Miss Marple entered, the conversation hushed, then shifted. Mrs. Radley, her expression pinched, was speaking to Mrs. Hargreaves in a tone that barely concealed accusation. "I'm only saying, Florence, that it seems odd, very odd, that Edith should faint right by those bushes, right where that man was seen prowling by the boys. And who's to say he wasn't waiting for someone?" Mrs. Hargreaves bristled. "That's quite enough, Margaret. If you mean to accuse anyone, speak plainly. My Edward says all this nonsense about Blackwood is just that, nonsense. He's a perfectly respectable man, and what's more, he's shown nothing but generosity since he came." Mrs. Price pounced on this. "You may trust him, Florence, but not everyone does. And if there's been trouble, we have a right to know, especially after last year. Let's not forget the church silver." A silence fell, as if the mention of the old theft had summoned ghosts from the corners. It was well known that the culprit had never been found, and the incident still rankled, especially among those whose donations had been most generous. Miss Marple stood quietly to one side, as though absorbed in the choice between knitting cotton and embroidery floss, but her sharp ears missed nothing. She noticed, too, the figure of Mr. Blackwood himself, tall and grave in his dark coat, entering the shop just then with a letter in hand. At his appearance, the conversation froze. The atmosphere was suddenly taut, every eye in the shop fixed either on him or pointedly away. Mr. Blackwood offered a polite nod to the room at large and handed his letter to Mrs. Price. "If you please, could you see this is posted to London? It's rather urgent." Mrs. Price took the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. First post, as always." Her tone was correct, but there was an edge to it that did not escape notice. As he turned to go, Mrs. Radley's voice, never loud but always insistent, broke the fragile peace. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood. Would you mind answering a question? Where were you yesterday morning, just after the rain?" Blackwood paused, his expression unreadable. "I was at home, Mrs. Radley. I spent most of the day indoors, catching up on correspondence." "Why do you ask?" Mrs. Radley flushed but pressed on. "It's just that my Bert saw someone near the Sutherland gate, very early, and not looking like a local. I hope you understand, we're all a little on edge after the fete." He regarded her with a cool, steady gaze. "I do understand, Mrs. Radley. But I assure you, I haven't set foot outside the grounds since Thursday. If anyone was seen near my gate, it wasn't me." He left then, as quietly as he had entered, but the tremor he caused remained, rippling through the gathering like a dropped pebble in still water. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Price leaned into Mrs. Radley, her voice shrill with satisfaction. "Did you see that? Not a word of real explanation. I'd wager he's hiding something." Miss Marple collected her purchase and slipped outside, her mind turning over the scene. The post office had always been the heart of village news, but today it felt more like a jury room, every villager weighing evidence, eager for someone to blame. She wondered if anyone else noticed the defensiveness in Mrs. Hargreaves' tone, or the relief in Mrs. Price's. Now that suspicion had a target, the burden of anxiety could be shifted elsewhere. She made her way along the green, passing the Hargreaves house. The curtains were open now, and she glimpsed Edward Hargreaves himself at the window, reading a letter with an intensity that suggested more than ordinary business. His wife appeared behind him, whispering something urgent, her hand on his shoulder. For a moment, Edward looked up and caught sight of Miss Marple, offering a polite but distracted nod. Miss Marple paused by the church. Here too the mood was altered. The vicar, usually genial and unflappable, looked harried as he greeted her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I can't stay, so many calls to make. The parish is in a state of, unease. You understand." "I do indeed, Reverend. These things have a way of unsettling even the steadiest of souls." He sighed, his gaze troubled. "I wish we knew what truly happened to Edith Vale. And I wish—" He broke off, then smiled weakly. "But wishing does little good, does it? Please give my regards to Mrs. Vale, won't you?" She promised she would, then continued on her way, passing a group of schoolchildren walking home for lunch, their conversation a muddle of half-remembered ghost stories and wild guesses about the Sutherland man. The boys who'd claimed to see a figure near the well the night of the fete now expanded their tale. There had been not one man, but two, and one of them had something shiny, like a lantern or a weapon. The details grew more fantastic with every telling. But as Miss Marple crossed the green, she paused, struck by a small incongruity. Just beneath the laurel where Edith had collapsed, something glinted in the sun, a tiny metal button, half buried in mud. She stooped to pick it up, brushing away the earth. It was plain, silver-plated, with a faint crest worked into the surface. Not the sort of thing that fell from a child's clothing, nor something that would pass unnoticed by its owner. She slipped it into her pocket, thoughtful. Another clue, perhaps, a clue that didn't fit the village's chosen narrative, but which might, in time, help untangle the true story from the web of rumor. By afternoon, clouds had swept back over Little Skelton, and a steady drizzle began once more. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she examined the button by lamplight, tracing the worn crest with a thoughtful finger. She set it aside with her other findings, a torn scrap of muslin, a list of names and alibis, half-remembered words spoken in fear or anger. The village, for all its certainties, was rarely what it seemed. Miss Marple, wise in the ways of human frailty, knew better than to trust the first answer or the second. She watched as darkness crept along the lanes, knitting in hand, waiting for the next subtle shift in the pattern of village life, and for the secrets that so many seemed desperate to keep. Frayed nerves. By the following morning, the unease that had shadowed Little Skelton for days began to show in sharper edges and frayed tempers. The village, usually a model of placid, well-ordered routines, now pulsed with subtle conflict. Even the gentle chime of the church bell seemed, to Miss Marple's ears, slightly discordant, as if echoing a note of discord among the villagers themselves. Miss Marple herself felt a particular restlessness as she tidied her breakfast things and drew the curtains wide. She set the silver button, a plain but curiously heavy thing, beside her saucer and examined it in the cold morning light. The crest was faded, but not entirely illegible, a stylized S, intertwined with laurel branches, too formal for a child's jacket, perhaps the insignia of a club or family. She made a mental note to consult her friend Mrs. Bantry, a collector of curiosities, should she call in for tea. But that must wait. Miss Marple had other priorities that morning, and her mind returned again and again to the uneasy expression she'd seen on Dr. Archer's face the previous afternoon. There was a reticence about the doctor, a hesitation uncharacteristic for a man so forthright in other matters. If anyone in Little Skelton knew the hidden sufferings of its inhabitants, it was Dr. Archer. Miss Marple determined that, under the guise of returning a book, she would call on him before noon. The lane to the Archer cottage was slick with last night's rain, yellow leaves already gathering in the gutters. Miss Marple passed the Hargreaves house, where voices rose in heated argument, Edward's sharp and anxious, Florence's brittle and tearful. At the Radleys, Only the shadow of Mrs. Radley's face at the upper window acknowledged her passing. Every house, it seemed, was holding its secrets close. Dr. Archer greeted her with a mixture of relief and surprise. "Miss Marple! What a pleasure! Come in, out of this wretched damp." His study was as she remembered, lined with battered medical volumes, the air heavy with pipe smoke and the faint scent of liniment. Miss Marple presented the forgotten book, then allowed herself to settle into the armchair opposite his desk. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said with her customary tact. "I confess, I hoped for a moment's advice on a personal puzzle." Dr. Archer's eyes crinkled with interest. "Always happy to help, Miss Marple. I'd wager your puzzles are rarely as simple as they seem." She smiled, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "Doctor, I'm troubled by the incident at the fete. Edith Vale's collapse was startling, of course, but it's the aftermath that concerns me. The village is awash in rumor, and yet, well, I sense something more than mere nerves. Perhaps you feel it too?" He rubbed his temples. "To be honest, yes. Edith is recovering. She's a sensitive girl, always has been, but I suspect her distress is not only physical. Her mother's been tense, withdrawn. I know the family's under strain, with Mr. Vale away so often. But I also noticed, well, Edith was terrified, truly terrified when she came to. She clung to her mother and asked if he was gone." "Did she say who?" Miss Marple asked gently. Dr. Archer shook his head. "No. But she glanced out the window, toward the Sutherland estate. And her mother, oddly, changed the subject at once. There's something the Valles aren't saying. And that's not all. I've heard from Mrs. Gillingham that young Tommy Radley's been having nightmares since the fete. Something about seeing a man with a lantern by the old well." Miss Marple considered this. "And have you seen anything unusual yourself, Doctor?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Perhaps. Last evening, as I walked home, I noticed someone in the Sutherland grounds, moving quickly between the trees. Too far to make out the face, but tall, wearing dark clothes. Not Blackwood, I think. He walks differently. It could have been one of the Hargreaves boys, or, well, anyone really. But I don't like it, Jane. The village is on edge. Secrets breed carelessness, and carelessness breeds disaster." They parted soon after, but not before Miss Marple pressed the silver button into his hand. "If you have any thoughts about this," she said, "I should be grateful." As she left, the first drops of a new rain began to fall. Miss Marple drew her hood close and took the long route home, pausing by the churchyard where Mr. Blackwood stood, apparently lost in thought, beside a weathered tombstone. He seemed not to notice her, and she did not intrude. But as she continued on, she noted the way his shoulders hunched, less in sorrow than in watchfulness. By midday, the drizzle had thickened into a persistent rain. Indoors, village life contracted, the lanes emptied, the shops grew quiet. Yet in every drawing room, every back kitchen, the talk churned on. Mrs. Price, confined by the weather, entertained a steady stream of callers, each more eager than the last for the latest morsel. Mrs. Radley's version of the post office encounter had now become a full-fledged accusation. Blackwood refused to explain himself. What's he hiding? Why, even the doctor suspects him. The Hargreaves quarrel, it was said, was about money and about certain letters Florence had received from London, letters that Edward had tried and failed to hide. Through it all, Miss Marple kept her own counsel. She sorted through her collection of facts, the muslin scrap, gone now, perhaps disposed of by its owner, the silver button with its enigmatic crest, the children's tales, the strange figure glimpsed in the woods. She wrote it all down in her neat hand, searching for connections, for the pattern beneath the confusion. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a new mackintosh and bearing a basket of pears. She eyed the button with delight. "Why, Jane, I believe this is from an old regimental blazer, possibly the Sutherland Volunteers, or perhaps the estate's staff livery. See this crest? Quite distinctive, though very old-fashioned now." "That is helpful, Dolly." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, filing the information away. As Mrs. Bantry departed, the sky darkened further. Thunder rumbled over the hills, and the power flickered in the lamps. Miss Marple sat in the growing gloom, watching the rain lash the glass, her thoughts circling ever closer to the Sutherland estate and its enigmatic new master. Evening brought little relief. The storm forced the entire village indoors, but tension brewed within those walls as surely as the tea in 100 kettles. At the Vale house, Edith watched the rain in silence, her mother's hand tight on her shoulder. At the Hargreaves', a lamp burned late, and voices carried, heated, desperate. Even Mrs. Price, for all her bravado, bolted her doors and sat uneasy by the fire, glancing often at the darkened window. As the hour grew late, Miss Marple prepared herself for bed, her heart troubled by the web of secrets. She knew the pattern well: a community under strain, trust eroding, the lines between fact and fancy blurring as the pressure mounted. The rain beat a steady tattoo on the roof as she slipped between the sheets, her mind already half dreaming, half searching for the clue that would make sense of it all. Somewhere in the night, a dog barked. Once, then again, sharp and alarmed. Miss Marple's eyes opened in the darkness, her heart pounding suddenly. She rose, crossed to the window, and peered into the blackness beyond the glass. A single light moved across the Sutherland grounds, bobbing gently between the trees. Someone was abroad in the storm, and whatever secret they carried, it would not remain hidden for much longer. Chapter 4. A Cry in the Night. The storm did not let up until the small hours, and when morning finally crept across Little Skelton, it did so with a leaden sky and a chill that crept beneath doors and around window panes. Branches dripped with rainwater, and puddles filled every hollow in the village lanes. It was as if the whole world had been washed clean, but the villagers felt no such clarity. If anything, the darkened weather only deepened their unease. Miss Marple slept lightly, her mind troubled by dreams of flickering lights among the trees and voices calling out in fear. When she rose, it was earlier than usual, the kettle hissing before the clock on her mantel had struck 7. As she sipped her tea, she turned once again to the silver button and her notebook of observations, lines of script carefully written and rewritten in the faint dawn. Outside, Little Skelton slowly woke to another day. Yet almost immediately, the village's routine was shattered. Shortly after 8, a frantic hammering at Miss Marple's door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find Sarah Gillingham, the vicar's daughter, raincoat askew, cheeks flushed with exertion and fear. "Miss Marple, please, you must come quickly. Mrs. Vale, she needs help. Something's happened to Edith." Miss Marple did not hesitate. She slipped her feet into sturdy shoes and followed Sarah at once, out into the wet street and up the winding lane toward the Vale house. Even as they hurried, she noticed anxious faces at the windows. Mrs. Radley peering from behind a curtain, Mr. Hargreaves watching with arms folded and jaw tight. Word traveled fast in Little Skelton. At the Valles, chaos reigned. The sitting room was a flurry of frightened whispers and urgent movement. Edith lay on the sofa, pale and shivering, her hair damp with sweat, her eyes wide and unseeing. Mrs. Vale hovered above her, wringing her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness," she gasped. She was screaming in her sleep. I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't stop. She just kept shouting about someone coming in the night, someone at the window. Miss Marple knelt by the sofa, her hand resting lightly on Edith's forehead. The girl's skin was clammy, her breath rapid. Miss Marple spoke gently, coaxing her from her terror. "Edith, my dear, you're safe now. Tell me, what frightened you so?" Edith's eyes fluttered. For a moment, it seemed she might not answer, but then her lips parted. "The light," she whispered. "The light in the garden. And a face, watching me. I thought it was him." Miss Marple smoothed the girl's hair, offering what comfort she could. "You saw a light outside? Was it someone you recognized?" Edith shook her head weakly. "It was too dark. But he was there, I know it." A sudden knock at the door made Mrs. Vale start. Dr. Archer entered, his coat hastily thrown on, his face set in lines of concern. He examined Edith swiftly, reassured Mrs. Vale in low tones, and prescribed rest and a mild sedative. "She's exhausted," he told Miss Marple privately. "Shock, mostly, though it wouldn't hurt to have someone stay with her tonight. When Dr. Archer left, the house fell into uneasy silence. Miss Marple remained for some time, soothing both Edith and her mother, her mind spinning with the implications of this new fright. If Edith's story was true, someone had indeed been prowling about the Vale house during the storm, perhaps the same figure seen on the Sutherland grounds. By mid-morning, the news had traveled as swiftly as the wind. At the post office, Mrs. Price was already holding court, recounting a vivid version of the story in which the mysterious prowler was none other than Mr. Blackwood. "He's always out late," she insisted, "and who else would have reason to skulk about in the rain? Mark my words, the police ought to be told." Mrs. Radley agreed, if only in part. "There's something wrong about that man, always keeping to himself." "But what about the Hargreaves?" "Florence was in tears again this morning, and Edward won't meet anyone's eye." Mrs. Hargreaves, when asked directly, merely shook her head and retreated indoors, declining even to fetch her milk as usual. The village, once united by routine, was now divided into wary camps, those who blamed the newcomer, those who suspected their own, and those who whispered of curses and old wrongs never righted. Miss Marple walked the village thoughtfully, making unobtrusive inquiries. At the Sutherland estate, she found the gate locked tight, Mr. Blackwood nowhere to be seen. The windows were shuttered, and the house seemed entirely deserted. Yet, on the path by the hedge, she found a faint print in the soft earth, a small, narrow shoe, likely a woman's. Not Edith's, whose shoes she remembered from yesterday, but perhaps Mrs. Vale's, or Florence Hargreaves, or someone else entirely. At noon, the clouds finally broke and the sun emerged, casting a wan glow over the troubled village. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and considered the evidence: the button with its Sutherland crest, the scrap of muslin, the children's stories of a man by the well, and now this new, fearful visitation in the night. The patterns were there, if only she could see how they fit. She took her lunch in silence, interrupted only by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, her basket empty now, her face lined with worry. "Jane, I've heard the latest. They say Edith saw a ghost or worse. You must know what's happening, can't you tell the police? The whole village is in a panic." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "We mustn't leap to conclusions, Dolly. Fear breeds confusion, and confusion breeds mistakes. But I believe we're closer to the truth than anyone realizes." Mrs. Bantry looked unconvinced but nodded. "If anyone can make sense of it, it's you." After her friend left, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, knitting set aside. She let her mind drift over every word and gesture, every tear and whisper she'd witnessed in recent days. She remembered Dr. Archer's nervous glance, Mrs. Hargreaves' distress, the secretive look in Mrs. Vale's eyes. As evening approached, the village settled into wary silence. Lights glimmered behind curtains, and doors were locked early. No one lingered outside, not even the children, who had taken to inventing tales of monsters in the woods. The wind rattled the windows, but no one dared investigate strange sounds. Even Mrs. Price, for all her bravado, kept her parlor dark. Miss Marple, however, remained alert. She made herself a cup of cocoa and set it by the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade from the village. Somewhere, she was certain, lay the key to the mystery. A simple fact overlooked, a detail dismissed. In the deepening twilight, she saw a movement by the churchyard. A figure, cloaked and hurried, disappearing among the gravestones. She watched, heart quickening, but did not move to follow. Instead, she resolved to wait until morning, when, in the clear light of day, the village might be ready to face the truth. For now, secrets clung to the hedges and shadows, and little Skelton waited, trembling, for whatever would come next. Chapter. Stirring the waters. Dawn arrived on a hush, with low clouds mottling the sky and dew silvering every hedge and fence post in Little Skelton. The storm's violence had given way to a tentative calm, yet it was not a peaceful quiet but rather the sort that falls before a reckoning. The village streets, often busy with children's laughter and the rattle of milk carts, felt oddly subdued. No one lingered long at the shops, eyes met only briefly before slipping away. Miss Marple, rising early after a restless night, dressed with care. She sensed the village was at a tipping point. Too many secrets, too many whispered fears. The events at the Vale House had rattled the entire parish, and Miss Marple knew that a single misstep, an accusation too hastily uttered, a confidence betrayed, might fracture little Skelton for good. After breakfast, she set out on her morning walk, basket in hand. She chose her route deliberately, winding first past the churchyard where she had seen the mysterious figure the night before. There was little to see in the cold light of day, no footprints, no evidence of trespass, only the damp grass and mossy stones, each grave marked with a story long since ended. Yet as Miss Marple paused by the old Sutherland monument, she noted a fresh mark in the earth, a narrow rut, as though a heel had slipped in the mud, less than 12 hours old. She made her way next to the high street, where the usual morning bustle was replaced by watchful silence. Mrs. Price stood in the post office window, eyes darting, lips pressed thin. The bell tinkled as Miss Marple entered. There was no queue this morning, only Mrs. Price and a single customer, Mr. Hargreaves, who appeared more disheveled than usual, his tie askew and his voice pitched lower than necessary. "I tell you, we're not safe so long as this goes on," he was saying, frustration prickling every word. "If the police won't do something, we'll have to take matters into our own hands." Mrs. Price clucked in agreement. "I couldn't sleep a wink, not after what happened to poor Edith. Mark my words, it'll be the Sutherland business all over again if someone doesn't step in." At Miss Marple's approach, their conversation cut off abruptly. Mr. Hargreaves muttered a greeting and quickly made his exit, the door banging behind him. Mrs. Price attempted to smile, but it was a nervous, perfunctory effort. "A dreadful thing, Jane," she sighed, "truly dreadful. Poor Mrs. Vale, she's aged 10 years overnight. I always said that house was unlucky. It's the proximity to the Sutherland place, if you ask me. Trouble breeds trouble." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, buying a packet of peppermints she did not need. "Have the police said anything new?" Mrs. Price shook her head. P.C. Farrow was around at dawn, but he looked half asleep himself. "No one's seen Mr. Blackwood, and you know what they're saying now. That it wasn't him at all, but a stranger, someone with a grudge, or maybe a vagrant. Oh, the stories people invent." "Stories can be dangerous," Miss Marple replied quietly. "They can start with a kernel of truth and grow out of all proportion." Mrs. Price bristled a bit, but nodded. "Well, something must be done. The village is losing its nerve, and I've never seen such division. Even the vicar's lost his confidence. He barely spoke at morning prayers." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside. The air was cold, a reminder that autumn was not far off. As she walked on, she saw Mrs. Gillingham in her garden, arms folded tight, staring at the closed windows of the Vale House across the lane. A look of real sorrow crossed the vicar's wife's face as Miss Marple approached. "I wonder if we'll ever get back to normal," Mrs. Gillingham said softly. "I feel as if the whole village is watching, waiting for something dreadful. I've started keeping a light on all night. Even Sarah is frightened." Miss Marple, with gentle wisdom, touched her arm. "People are resilient, my dear. This cloud will pass, though not without some pain, I'm afraid. Has there been any more trouble?" Mrs. Gillingham hesitated, glancing around. "Only that someone was seen near the Hargreaves' back gate last night. Florence swears she heard a voice, calling her name. Edward was out. He says he saw no one, but she's terrified." "That is troubling," Miss Marple mused. "Did she say if the voice was familiar?" "She wouldn't say," Mrs. Gillingham replied, "but she's convinced it was a warning. And, oh, Jane, I hesitate to mention it, but Mrs. Vale confided that Edith's been sleepwalking. Twice, she's found her standing by the window, staring at the Sutherland woods." The conversation trailed off as the church bell rang, calling for an unscheduled parish meeting. News of this spread quickly, and by mid-morning, most of the villagers had gathered in the nave, anxious, fidgeting, voices low. The vicar, his face gray with worry, addressed them with trembling hands. "I know these are unsettling times," he began, "and that fear can make us do and say things we regret. But we must remember who we are, neighbors, friends. We cannot let suspicion tear us apart." He implored them to let the police handle matters, and to keep an open mind. But even as he spoke, it was clear the villagers were restless. Some muttered that more action was needed, that someone must be responsible. Eyes darted to Mr. Blackwood, who had arrived late and sat stiffly at the rear, his expression stony and distant. After the meeting, as people filed out, Miss Marple noticed Florence Hargreaves lingering by the font, twisting her handkerchief. Her face was drawn, lips pressed tight. Sensing distress, Miss Marple approached quietly. "My dear, is there something you wish to share?" Florence looked around, then whispered, "Jane, I haven't slept in 2 nights. Last evening, Edward left for the bank, and soon after, I heard a tapping at the back gate, a voice as clear as anything, calling me by name. But when I looked, there was no one there. Only a piece of cloth, caught on the latch. I was too frightened to pick it up. Would you show me?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but intent. Florence nodded, eyes brimming. "It's still there. I couldn't bring myself to touch it." They walked together to the Hargreaves' back gate, the path slippery with wet leaves. There, snagged on the iron latch, was a fragment of fabric, light muslin, torn and damp, unmistakably similar to the piece Miss Marple had found after the fete. She examined it closely. The pattern was faded but visible, a faint crest, entwined with laurel, almost identical to the one on the silver button. Florence shivered. "What does it mean? Why us?" Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "I believe, Florence, it means that someone is trying to frighten you, or perhaps leave a message. But who and why? Those are the questions we must answer." Florence nodded, wiping her eyes. "I trust you, Jane. If anyone can find the truth, you can." As the day waned, Miss Marple returned home, the muslin scraps safely wrapped and the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than ever. The pattern was growing clearer. Someone moved at night, slipping between the village houses and the Sutherland woods, leaving behind tokens meant to unsettle and divide. But the question that haunted Miss Marple most was not who lurked in the darkness, but what secret bound the villagers so tightly that fear itself seemed to seep from the soil. As evening descended and the village lights flickered on, Miss Marple watched from her window, knitting untouched in her lap. The answer was close, she could feel it. But, as ever, in Little Skelton, the truth lay beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Chapter 5. The Quiet Game. The morning after the parish meeting dawned cool and clear, a fragile contrast to the undercurrent of unrest that continued to thread through Little Skelton. The sun's pale rays filtered through lace curtains and warmed the cobbled streets, but there was no warming of spirits. The village moved through its familiar motions, yet each smile seemed slightly forced, each greeting slightly guarded. Miss Marple observed all this from her usual vantage point, the window seat of her sitting room, a fresh cup of tea resting on the table beside her knitting. Her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, traced the comings and goings below, noting the fleeting glances between neighbors, the way the children's laughter was more subdued, the taut set of even the most composed faces. Her thoughts returned frequently to the gathering of the previous evening, the vicar's cautious words, the growing division among the villagers, and most of all, to Mr. Lionel Blackwood. He was a man cloaked not only in a physical dark coat but in an aura of secrets. Though he rarely spoke with more than necessary civility, Miss Marple had long suspected he was not simply a reclusive landowner, but someone guarding something carefully. Today, she resolved, she would begin a subtle and quiet game, the sort of gentle test for which she was renowned. It would involve no confrontation, no grand accusations. Rather, she would engage Mr. Blackwood in casual conversation, watching carefully for the faintest flicker of a reaction, a hesitation, a tell. At mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way along the village street, basket in hand, towards the small cafe near the village green. It was a neutral meeting place, where the likelihood of an encounter was high. As she rounded the corner, she saw him seated at a corner table alone, his usual stern expression softened by the morning light. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she said, approaching with her characteristic calm. "May I join you for a moment?" He looked up, a hint of surprise crossing his features, quickly masked. "Miss Marple. Of course. Please." She took the seat opposite him, placing her basket on the chair beside her. "I trust you slept well, despite the recent disturbances?" He shrugged. "As well as one can in such a place. The village has its character." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Character can be charming, but sometimes it breeds unease. You must understand that many here find recent events unsettling." "Unsettling is one word for it," Blackwood said quietly. "But I've seen worse in London." "Ah, but this is not London," Miss Marple replied softly. "People here remember. They remember long past grievances, old secrets. Sometimes those memories grow heavier than the present." He regarded her carefully, then nodded. "I'm aware. And I assure you, I wish no harm to this village. I came here for peace." "Peace is a precious thing," Miss Marple agreed, "and sometimes it requires patience and understanding. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, do you find it difficult to adapt to village life?" He smiled faintly, a brief softening of his usual reserve. "I do not find it easy, no. But I am willing to try." Their conversation flowed easily, covering small topics, weather, village events, books, and Miss Marple watched him closely. There was a subtle tension beneath his civility, as if he guarded not just words but emotions as well. When she mentioned Edith Vale's fainting, he stiffened imperceptibly but offered no comment. After a time, Miss Marple rose, thanking him for his company. "I hope you will forgive my intrusion, but I find it helpful to understand those around me." "Not at all, Miss Marple. I appreciate your candor." As she left, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. Blackwood was careful, even cautious, but there was nothing overtly suspicious in their talk. Yet the man's measured reserve was a kind of mask, and she was certain that beneath it lay a deeper story. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the post office, where the atmosphere was thick with gossip and speculation. Mrs. Price greeted her with a knowing smile. "Back so soon, Jane? The village is alive with theories. Some say Blackwood is involved, others whisper of the Hargreaves. It's a web, tangled and wide." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes, the simplest thread leads to the unraveling." Mrs. Price lowered her voice. "You ought to watch Mrs. Vale. She's been seen speaking quietly with Mr. Hargreaves several times now. And Edith, well, she's withdrawn completely." Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Vale again. The connections, she felt, were beginning to form a pattern. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, knitting needles clicking softly. She considered the scraps of information, the torn muslin, the silver button, the shadowy figure in the woods, Edith's fearful visions, and now the strained alliances among the villagers. She knew she would soon need to gently draw out the truth, to confront the tangled loyalties and hidden resentments with a careful hand. But for now, she waited, patient, observant, and ready. Ripples in still water. The days that followed Miss Marple's conversation with Mr. Blackwood passed in a tense mixture of routine and quiet unrest. Little Skelton appeared to hold its breath, moving through its familiar rhythms while beneath the surface currents of suspicion and fear pulled relentlessly at the village's fabric. Miss Marple maintained her usual calm, visiting familiar haunts and neighbors with gentle attentiveness. She found Mrs. Vale more withdrawn than before, her smiles rarer, her eyes shadowed by fatigue and something deeper, unspoken. One afternoon, Miss Marple decided to call, bearing a small basket of preserves and a quiet readiness to listen. The Vale cottage seemed hushed, the windows curtained tightly despite the mild sunshine. Mrs. Vale received her with a fragile warmth, inviting her inside with a hesitant gesture. Edith was not present, Miss Marple noted, and Mrs. Vale's fingers trembled slightly as she poured tea. They spoke of everyday matters, the weather, the vicar's plans, the coming harvest festival. But Miss Marple's practiced gaze noted the way Mrs. Vale's voice faltered when the fate was mentioned, and how her hands clutched the teacup a little too tightly. "Jane," Mrs. Vale said at last, lowering her voice, "I don't know how much more of this Edith can bear. She's frightened, not just of what she saw, but of what might follow. I feel as though shadows are gathering around us, and no one knows what's real and what's imagined." Miss Marple reached out, placing a comforting hand over Mrs. Vale's. "You are not alone, my dear. Sometimes," sharing even the smallest fear lightens its weight. Mrs. Vale sighed, eyes glistening. There are things I cannot say, Jane. Things buried long ago, but now they threaten to surface. It's as if the past is reaching for us. Before Miss Marple could press further, Edith's soft footsteps echoed in the hall. She entered, pale but steady, and offered Miss Marple a shy smile. "You're looking better," Miss Marple said gently. Edith nodded, though her gaze flickered away. "I'm trying." After a few more moments, Miss Marple took her leave, promising to visit again soon. Outside, she paused to consider the growing web of anxiety spun tightly around the Vale family and the faint, flickering outlines of secrets yet unrevealed. Later that day, an unexpected event sent a fresh ripple through the village. As the sun lowered behind the hills, a hurried knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. She opened it to find P.C. Farrow, breathless and serious. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we've had an incident at the old Sutherland gate. Someone's left a package, wrapped and tied with string. No one saw who." Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple followed the constable to the scene. The gate stood as always, locked and weathered, but at its base lay a small parcel. Carefully unwrapping it, Miss Marple revealed a leather-bound notebook, its cover scuffed and worn. She opened it gently, pages yellowed but filled with neat handwriting. The entries were dated months before the recent troubles. Notes on village events, snippets of overheard conversations, and curious references to hidden debts and promises broken. "This could be important," Miss Marple murmured. P.C. Farrow nodded. "I'll have it taken to the sergeant. But I thought you might want to see it first." As she held the notebook, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. Here was a clue that might unravel the threads binding the village's uneasy silence. Returning home, she settled by the fire to read, each page drawing her deeper into a tale of old grievances, complicated loyalties, and shadows cast long before the fate. The village, she knew, was poised on the edge of revelation. The pieces were coming together, but the final picture remained blurred, waiting for the moment when all would be clear and justice, in its quiet way, could be served. Over tea, Miss Marple broached the subject that weighed heavily on both their minds. Chapter 6. Threads of the Past. The discovery of the notebook at the Sutherland gate cast a new shadow over Little Skelton, stirring whispers that wove through the village like a restless wind. The faded pages, filled with coded references and half-spoken grudges, hinted at a history deeper and darker than any had dared to imagine. Miss Marple, however, approached the revelations with her characteristic caution and patience, knowing that truth was often layered beneath layers of fear and deception. In the quiet of her sitting room, with the late autumn light waning, Miss Marple spread the notebook across her lap and began to study the entries more closely. Many were mundane observations, a village fair here, a tiff at the Women's Institute there, but woven throughout were veiled comments. The debt remains unpaid, old promises broken, the mistake no one must remember. She underlined each cryptic phrase with a pencil, her mind weaving threads between names and events. One name recurred frequently, Sutherland. Not the family, but a circle of villagers who had once been involved in a bitter dispute decades earlier, dispute that had fractured friendships and perhaps even families. There were also references to the well and the silence in the orchard, places that had already surfaced in the children's tales and Edith's fearful visions. That evening, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Archer, whom she trusted to help interpret the notebook's subtle clues. They met at his cottage, where over cups of strong tea they discussed the tangled web hinted at in the pages. The debt, Dr. Archer mused, tapping his chin thoughtfully, might refer to a financial arrangement gone wrong, but it could also mean a moral or personal debt. Villages have their codes, Jane. I suspect this is more than money. And the orchard, Miss Marple added, is just beyond the Sutherland estate. I have heard whispers of secrets buried there, things too painful to speak of openly. Dr. Archer nodded gravely. It's no surprise that fears and old resentments have resurfaced, especially with a stranger like Blackwood stirring the waters. After their meeting, Miss Marple returned home, her mind racing through the village's hidden past, the notebook's fragmented messages, and the fresh unease gripping the community. She knew she would have to tread carefully. Some secrets were guarded fiercely, and the wrong question could ignite old wounds anew. The next morning, as mist curled around the village green, Miss Marple set out to visit the Hargreaves. She found Florence in the kitchen, busy with her morning chores but distracted, her eyes shadowed. "I wanted to ask you," Miss Marple began gently, "about your husband's recent trips to London. Is there something troubling you both?" Florence hesitated, then confessed in a low voice, "Edward has been involved in some financial difficulties. I don't know all the details, but I fear it has something to do with the old estate. There are debts we never spoke of." Miss Marple nodded, recognizing the pattern. "Sometimes silence can weigh heavier than words, Florence." As she left, she saw Edward return, looking drawn and weary. Their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple sensed a burden too heavy to carry alone. The day passed with the village holding its collective breath. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Mr. Blackwood. His usual guarded demeanor was softened by an uncharacteristic urgency. "I've heard of the notebook," he said quietly, "and the stir it's caused. I wish to speak frankly, Miss Marple. There are things you do not know about this village and about me." She invited him in, and over tea he revealed fragments of a story long buried, a family legacy tarnished by betrayal, a land dispute that had fractured generations, and a promise to protect a secret at any cost. Yet, even as he spoke, Miss Marple detected the careful omission of key details, the edges of truth obscured by pride and fear. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock. P.C. Farrow entered, bearing news that would again unsettle the village. A stranger had been seen near the orchard at dusk, moving swiftly and vanishing before pursuit. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The pieces were moving, the past and present converging. The village's fragile calm was breaking, and with it, the truth was beginning to emerge, slowly, inexorably. Echoes of the orchard. The chill of early November seeped into the bones of little Skelton, turning the hedgerows brittle and the nights swiftly dark. The village, though outwardly tranquil, bore the weight of whispered fears and furtive glances. The orchard, once a place of quiet respite, had become a focal point for restless speculation. Miss Marple's visit to the orchard was prompted by the recent sighting of a stranger near its gnarled trees, a figure moving like a shadow at dusk, as P.C. Farrow had reported. The place was a tangled patchwork of ancient apple trees, their branches heavy with the last bruised fruit of the season, and grass thick with fallen leaves. It was easy to see how such a place could harbor secrets. As she walked along the muddy path, Miss Marple's eyes caught a faint disturbance near the base of an old oak. Kneeling, she uncovered a torn scrap of paper, weathered but still legible. The faded handwriting spoke of a meeting long ago, a pact made under the cover of night, binding parties to silence and secrecy. She tucked the paper into her pocket and looked around, the wind whispering through the branches like a murmured confession. Here, she thought, was a place where the past lingered stubbornly, refusing to yield its hold. Her return to the village found the community simmering with unease. At the post office, Mrs. Price was in fine form, recounting the latest gossip to an eager audience. "Did you hear about the strange lights in the orchard last night? Some say it was a signal, others say a warning. Whatever it was, it's not good news for little Skelton." Miss Marple offered a quiet smile and purchased a few necessities, her mind absorbing every whispered theory and pointed glance. Later that day, she found herself drawn once more to the Vale cottage. Edith, though still fragile, seemed steadier, and Mrs. Vale welcomed her with a tentative warmth. "Have you any idea who might want to frighten you, Edith? Or what might be the purpose of these visits and messages?" Edith's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, Mrs. Marple. Sometimes I think it's about the past, things that were done, promises broken. But I'm afraid to ask." Mrs. Vale nodded solemnly. "There are stories, passed down quietly, about old debts and about the orchard. Things no one speaks of openly, but which linger like shadows." Miss Marple listened carefully, her fingers tightening around her teacup. The web was indeed growing more intricate, threads of history and fear entwined. That evening, the village gathered for a hastily arranged meeting in the village hall. The vicar's voice was steady but strained as he addressed the crowd. "We must come together as a community," he urged. "Fear and suspicion serve no one. We must seek understanding and face our pasts if we are to move forward." Yet beneath his call for unity, tensions flared. Accusations lingered in the air, directed at Mr. Blackwood, the Hargreaves, and others whose motives were questioned but unspoken. Miss Marple watched quietly from the back, noting the subtle exchanges, the narrowing of eyes, the tightening of jaws. She knew that the truth was close, but so too was resistance. As the meeting ended and the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple found herself approached by Mrs. Radley, who lowered her voice. "Jane, I'm afraid this won't end well if someone doesn't act soon. There are old wounds here that haven't healed, and I fear they're about to be torn open." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "It is always the past that shapes the present. But we must be patient and careful." Returning home beneath a sky streaked with stars, Miss Marple felt the weight of the village's secret pressing ever closer. The orchard, the torn notes, the fearful visits, they were pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. And as she sat by the fire, knitting paused in her lap, she knew the moment to act was drawing near. The night was quiet, but the silence was charged. Somewhere in Little Skelton, hidden among the trees and shadows, the secret waited, for the truth to be unearthed, and for justice to be quietly done. Chapter 7. The Weight of Silence. The days grew shorter and colder as November pressed deeper into Little Skelton, and the village seemed to shrink beneath the lengthening shadows. Windows glowed faintly in the dusk, and the air carried a crispness that made breath visible in quiet puffs. For many, the gathering chill was a reminder of the coming winter. For others, a mirror of the unease that settled ever more firmly over the community. Miss Marple moved through the village as usual, her gait unhurried but her mind keenly alert. The recent events, the fainting, the night terrors, the mysterious sightings, had unsettled even the most stoic residents. The orchard, once a place of innocent pastime, was now spoken of only in hushed tones, a locus of dread and whispered speculation. This morning, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the Vale cottage. She knew Edith's condition was fragile, and she wished to offer what comfort she could. The door was opened by Mrs. Vale herself, her eyes shadowed but grateful for the visitor. Inside, Edith sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap. She glanced up with a timid smile that was quickly replaced by a look of weariness. "I'm glad you came, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I feel better, but the dreams, they don't stop." Miss Marple settled into a chair nearby, her eyes gentle. Dreams have a way of stirring what the waking mind would rather forget. "Tell me, Edith, do you remember what frightens you most?" The girl hesitated before whispering, "It's the orchard. The voices, the footsteps. I see shadows moving just beyond the trees, and I hear whispers calling my name." Mrs. Vale clasped her daughter's hand tightly, her own voice trembling. "There's history there, Jane. Things buried long ago. We've tried to keep them hidden, but the past has a way of creeping back." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Secrets often do. But sometimes shining a light on them can bring peace." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Vale opened it to reveal Mr. Hargreaves, looking somewhat anxious but determined. "Mrs. Vale, Edith," he began, "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought it best to come by myself, no one else should hear. But there are matters we need to discuss quietly." Inside, after a brief exchange, he confided in Miss Marple and Mrs. Vale about a recent discovery. Hidden among some old documents he had found in the village archives was a letter hinting at a long-forgotten dispute involving the Sutherland estate, a clandestine agreement, and a family betrayal that had left lingering scars. Miss Marple listened intently as he spoke of promises broken and debts unpaid, the weight of silence pressing down on the village for generations. "The orchard," he said quietly, "was once the site of more than just apple trees. It witnessed arguments, accusations, even threats. That's why people fear it." As he left, Miss Marple and Mrs. Vale exchanged solemn looks. The shadows were lengthening, and the past was no longer content to remain buried. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple attended a gathering at the village hall, where the vicar had convened a meeting to address the growing unrest. The hall was filled with murmurs and sideways glances, the atmosphere thick with tension. The vicar's words were steady but carried a note of urgency. We must seek unity and understanding. Fear and suspicion will only harm us further. Yet beneath the surface, divisions deepened. Mr. Blackwood sat near the back, his posture rigid, eyes scanning the room with quiet calculation. Mrs. Radley whispered with Mrs. Price about the latest rumors, their voices sharp. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Florence Hargreaves, who sat clutching her handkerchief, face pale and drawn. The weight of unspoken truths seemed to press heavily upon her. After the meeting, Miss Marple was approached by P.C. Farrow, who looked troubled. Miss Marple, there's something you should know. Last night, the orchard was disturbed again, footprints, broken branches. But no one saw who it was. It's as if someone is trying to unsettle the village. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The pattern was clear. Someone was deliberately stirring fear, using the village's secrets as a weapon. That evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced like the secrets she sought to uncover. She held the torn scraps of muslin, the silver button, and the faded notes in her hands, piecing together the story they told. The village of Little Skelton was a place where the past refused to stay silent. And Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, was ready to bring that silence to an end. The quiet reckoning. The nights grew colder still as November gave way to early December, the frost settling softly over Little Skelton, painting the hedgerows silver and frosting the bare branches of the orchard trees. The village, wrapped in its quiet blanket of winter, appeared calm, but beneath the surface, the unrest that had troubled its heart persisted like a slow-burning ember. Miss Marple moved through these days with the serene steadiness of one accustomed to waiting, knitting in hand, eyes always alert to the nuances others overlooked. The fragments of muslin, the silver button, the faded notes from the found notebook, they all tugged at her thoughts, threads waiting to be woven into a whole. Her visits to the Vale cottage had become more frequent. Edith, though improved in health, remained haunted by nightmares and shadowed visions, and Mrs. Vale's fatigue was increasingly evident. Miss Marple's gentle presence offered comfort, but she knew the family's true burden lay beyond her reach, locked away in silences no neighbor dared breach. One afternoon, as snow began to fall lightly, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the church, where the vicar awaited to discuss the forthcoming Christmas preparations. The village had rallied to maintain some semblance of festivity, hoping to stave off the gloom that had settled so heavily. As they spoke, Miss Marple observed the subtle exchanges among villagers gathering in the churchyard, the whispered suspicions, the cautious smiles, the wary glances toward the Sutherland estate. The past, it seemed, cast long shadows indeed. Later that day, a sudden incident shook the fragile peace. A commotion near the village green drew Miss Marple's attention as a crowd gathered around the post office. Mrs. Price, flushed and breathless, was at the center, clutching a letter she insisted had been anonymously slipped under her door. The letter was brief but chilling, a warning to cease digging into the village's secrets or suffer consequences. The message rippled through the community like a stone cast into still water, stirring fear and defiance in equal measure. Accusations grew louder, trust frayed, and Miss Marple felt the delicate threads of unity threatening to unravel entirely. That evening, she sought out Mr. Blackwood, hoping his position as newcomer and landowner might offer insight or at least a calming influence. She found him in the dim light of his study, surrounded by papers and maps. Their conversation was careful, each word weighed, but as they spoke, Miss Marple detected a crack in his usual composure, a hint of frustration, perhaps, or weariness. He spoke of his own desire for peace, of the burdens carried by family legacies, and of a past he had hoped to leave behind. Yet, when she pressed gently about the orchard and the old disputes, he deflected with practiced skill. "Some things," he said quietly, "are better left buried." Miss Marple nodded, knowing well the power of silence. Returning home through the snowy lanes, her thoughts raced with the knowledge that the moment of reckoning was close. The villagers' fears were manifesting in whispers and warnings, and someone, unseen but felt, sought to keep the past sealed. She sat by the fire, knitting forgotten, pondering the delicate balance of trust and suspicion. The truth, she realized, would not simply be revealed, it would have to be drawn out, carefully and deliberately. The quiet reckoning was at hand, and Miss Marple was ready to face it. Chapter 8. The secret she never told anyone. The Christmas season arrived with a brittle chill that deepened the shadows across Little Skelton. Snow lay thick on the fields, muffling footsteps and softening the village's edges. Inside the warmly lit cottages, fires crackled, and carols drifted through curtained windows, but beneath the festive veneer, tension simmered like embers ready to flare. Miss Marple, serene and composed as ever, sat in her sitting room surrounded by the familiar warmth of her home, her knitting resting untouched. The events of recent weeks weighed heavily on her mind. The fainting at the fete, the mysterious visits to the orchard, the torn scraps of muslin, the cryptic notebook, the anonymous letter threatening silence. Tonight, the village was holding its annual carol service at St. Mildred's. Miss Marple arrived early, seating herself near the back, watching the familiar faces gather, some hopeful, others wary. The vicar's voice echoed in the stone nave, calling for peace and unity. But Miss Marple knew peace was a fragile thing. As the congregation sang, she observed quietly the furtive glances of Mrs. Radley toward Mr. Blackwood, the pallor of Mrs. Vale, the tense set of Florence Hargreaves' jaw. Beneath the hymn's sweetness, old wounds festered. After the service, Miss Marple lingered near the doorway, where a small group had gathered in subdued conversation. She gently approached, her voice low but clear. "May I speak with you all for a moment? There is something I believe we must face together." The group fell silent, curiosity and unease mingling in their eyes. With the quiet authority that had long commanded respect, Miss Marple began to unravel the threads she had gathered, drawing upon the subtle clues in behavior, the fragments of conversation, and the overlooked details no one else had seen. She spoke of the orchard's history, the old disputes, the debts unpaid not just in coin but in trust and honor. She revealed how the scraps of muslin and the silver button linked the families, how fear and silence had bound them in a fragile truce. Then, with a gentle but piercing gaze, she turned to Mrs. Vale and Florence Hargreaves. The fears, the messages, the visits, they were born not from strangers or dark intruders, but from the shadows within our own walls. The pain and secrets carried silently for years have at last found voice. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. It is time for truth, not blame nor recrimination, but truth, and for healing to begin. The room was heavy with unspoken emotion. Mrs. Vale's lips trembled as she looked toward Edith, who clung to her mother's hand. Florence's eyes filled with tears, and even Mr. Blackwood's stern facade softened. Slowly, a confession emerged, not of crime or betrayal, but of regret and misunderstanding, of actions taken in fear and silence that had spiraled beyond control. Miss Marple listened with the patience of a lifetime, offering quiet counsel as the villagers faced the secret they had long avoided. As the night deepened and the village gathered to share in renewed hope, Miss Marple stepped outside into the crisp air. Snowflakes drifted silently, settling on the darkened lanes and hedgerows. She looked back toward the warmly lit church and then up at the starry sky. In that moment, she allowed herself a small smile. The secret had been told. The shadow lifted, if only a little. And in the quiet that followed, Little Skelton might at last find peace.